The African continent, a historic victim of slavery and colonialism.
Yeah, welcome to Voicetv Nigeria. I'm your host, Afolabi Wahab. The world leaders have recognized that Africa has been treated unfairly, and now they are beginning to acknowledge their wrong against Africa, calling for justice for African nations. It's no longer business as usual. African leaders are sleeping, but they are not really sleeping. African leaders, 90% of African leaders, absolutely corrupt because they are working with the Western world, the Western leaders, against the interests of their people. But now, African youths are waking up. 7 countries under military rule, but the Western leaders, honestly, they are afraid. They are smelling the coffee. It's time for Africa to come together and work.
The African continent, a historic victim of slavery and colonialism, continues to confront grave injustices. On average, African countries pay 4 times more for borrowing than the United States and 8 times more than the wealthiest European countries. And African countries accounts for just 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but it is an epicenter of climate chaos, suffering disproportionately impacts of climate change. And so looking ahead, I saw 2 priorities for action and justice. First, on the economic front. Redesigning today's outdated, dysfunctional and unfair global financial architecture is essential, but I know it won't happen overnight. Yet we can and must take practical action now. The Sustainable Development Goals stimulus I have proposed, an effective debt workout mechanism, and other steps necessary to multiply the resources available for developing countries are vital for sustainable development in Africa and to give options to African governments to support the development of their peoples. We must also drastically step up climate action and climate justice. I have put forward the Climate Solidarity Pact, in which developed countries provide financial and technical support to help emerging economies in Africa and beyond to promote an equitable and just transition to renewable energy. And I have presented an acceleration agenda to boost these efforts, with developed countries committing to reach net zero emissions as close as possible to 2040 and developing countries as close as possible to 2050. And developed countries must also finally keep their promises to developing countries by meeting the 100 billion goal, doubling adaptation finance, replenishing the Green Climate Fund, and operationalizing the Loss and Damage Fund this year. And as a matter of justice, Africa must be considered a priority. We are confronting existential challenges. The climate crisis is spiraling out of control. A global cost of living crisis is raging. Poverty, hunger and inequalities are growing against the objectives of the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. New technologies are raising red flags without a global architecture to deal with them. And geopolitical divides and conflicts are multiplying with profound global implications, especially the impacts from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Excellencies, we are moving towards a multipolar world, and that is a positive thing. But multipolarity in itself is not enough to guarantee a peaceful or just global community. To be a factor of peace, equity and justice in international relations, multipolarity must be supported by strong and effective multilateral institutions. Look no further than the situation in Europe at the dawn of the last century. Europe was multipolar, but it lacked strong multilateral mechanisms, and the result was World War I. As the global community moves towards multipolarity, we desperately need and I have been vigorously advocating for, a strengthened and reformed multilateral architecture based on the UN Charter and international law. Today's global governance structures reflect yesterday's world. They were largely created in the aftermath of World War II, when many African countries were still ruled by colonial powers and were not even at the table. And this is particularly true of the Security Council of the United Nations and for multilateral institutions to remain truly universal, they must reform to reflect today's power and economic realities and not the power and economic realities of the post-Second World War. In the absence of such reform, fragmentation is inevitable. And we cannot afford a world with a divided global economy and financial system, with diverging strategies on technology, including artificial intelligence, and with conflicting security frameworks. The IMF estimates that such a fracture could cost 7% of global GDP, a cost that would be disproportionately borne by low-income countries, mainly in Africa. And so I've come to Johannesburg with a simple message. In a fracturing world with overwhelming crises, there is simply no alternative to cooperation. We must urgently restore trust and reinvigorate multilateralism for the 21st century. And this requires the courage to compromise in the reforms that are necessary for the common good. And it requires full respect for the UN Charter, international law, universal values, and all human rights, social, cultural, economic, civil and political. And it requires much greater solidarity.
Welcome back. A TikTok user, Danny Collin, have break down the racism in 2023. Come on. At this present age, the racism is growing in progressional form. When you listen to this, you know that the racism is still up. The France president have really apologized to Africa for what they've done in the past. But there is a serious plan on the way against the black. And racism, when is this going to stop? We don't know. Maybe until the kingdom comes. When is the kingdom going to come? Nobody knows.
Ask me what was my aha moment, what made me change my perspective, and it's when I saw this. So a black person in the United States during the Jim Crow era faced second-class citizenship, disenfranchisement, barriers to voting, barriers to education, barriers to employment, and barriers to housing. Then we had the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which stated we could no longer do any of this, we could no longer discriminate based on race. So in 2023, what is the only group of people that we can legally discriminate against? We can legally relegate to second-class citizenship, create barriers to voting, barriers to education, barriers to employment, barriers to housing. If you answer convicted felon, you are absolutely correct. In 2023, a convicted felon is the only group of people that we can legally do all this to. Now, do you believe it's a coincidence that 1 in 3 black males carry this label as convicted felon as opposed to 1 in 17 white males? If you answered yes to that question, let's take a look at what's happened since the dismantling of the Jim Crow laws. We've had a 700% increase in our prison population. We've gone from 300,000 inmates to as high as 2.3 million. Now, I do believe we're back down to about 1.8 million today. We had the law and order agenda, which was an increase in police spending and a decrease in school funding, which created the school to prison pipeline. We also had the war on drugs, which we now know was a war on people. We had the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, and we had the 1994 Crime Bill. Now, the 86 Anti-Drug Abuse Act differentiated between rock cocaine and powder cocaine, which we know predominantly impacted the black community. And the 94 Crime Bill created harsher sentences, lengthier sentences, and minimum mandatories. We also know that black people make up 53% of all exonerations, 69% of exonerations for drug crimes, and they're 7 times more likely to be wrongly convicted. So when I seen all of this, I realized that